Europe in the early 1900s was a powder keg, a continent brimming with tension, ambition, and a complex web of relationships that were about to unravel. Decades of simmering rivalries and competing interests had created an environment ripe for conflict. Nationalism, a fervent devotion to one's nation, was sweeping across the continent. Militarism, the belief in maintaining a strong military force, was seen as a symbol of national prestige and power. Imperialism, the desire to expand empires and control overseas territories, fueled competition and resentment among European powers. Entangled alliances designed to ensure security, ironically made a large-scale war almost certain. These agreements, often made in secret, committed nations to defend one another, turning small disputes into potential global conflicts. National pride fueled rivalry and mistrust, with each nation believing in its own superiority and destiny. This toxic mix of pride and suspicion meant that even minor disputes could quickly escalate into matters of honor, threatening the fragile peace. An arms race saw nations amass huge armies and navies, each trying to outdo the other in military might. This constant military buildup made the continent tense and volatile, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The scramble for colonies bred resentment, particularly as nations clashed over territory and resources. This was especially true for Germany, a rising power eager to challenge the established empires of Britain and France and assert its place on the world stage. Secret alliances split Europe into two opposing camps: the Triple Entente, consisting of France, Britain, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, composed of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. These alliances meant that any localized conflict could quickly spiral out of control, drawing in multiple nations and escalating into a full-blown European war. When crisis struck in the Balkans, a region known as the powder keg of Europe, the entire continent, bound by treaties and fueled by nationalistic fervor, was inexorably pulled into the devastating conflict that would become known as World War I. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. This single act, fueled by nationalist fervor, would serve as the spark that ignited a global conflict. It set off a chain reaction, a complex web of alliances activated with alarming speed, drawing nation after nation into the escalating crisis, and Europe was quickly plunged into war. The major powers, bound by treaties, mobilized their armies, preparing for a conflict of unprecedented scale. The Western Front, a line stretching hundreds of miles, soon became a nightmare of trench warfare. Soldiers lived in mud, surrounded by barbed wire, and faced constant danger from enemy fire and disease. Battles like Verdun, a brutal and protracted struggle, and the Somme, characterized by massive offensives and staggering casualties, saw hundreds of thousands killed on both sides, locked in a bloody stalemate. Gains were minimal, often measured in yards, not miles, for little gain. New weapons, the products of rapid industrial advancement, machine guns that could mow down entire waves of soldiers, poison gas that choked and blinded, and tanks, primitive but terrifying, made the fighting even more deadly, turning the battlefield into a landscape of unimaginable horror. No man's land, the area between opposing trenches, was a graveyard, a desolate expanse of shell holes and shattered dreams. Soldiers faced terror and futility daily, enduring constant bombardment and the ever-present threat of death. The war's scale and brutality, fueled by technological advancements and unwavering nationalism, were unlike anything the world had ever seen, leaving an indelible scar on the global psyche. Technology and tactics had far outpaced humanity's ability to cope with the consequences, leading to unprecedented levels of destruction and loss. The war drew in nations worldwide, but the main struggle was between the Central Powers and the Allies. Soldiers endured horrific conditions: disease, hunger, and the trauma of constant shellfire. Many suffered from what we now call PTSD, longing for peace and letters home. Civilians too were mobilized, women filled factories, rationing became routine, and propaganda shaped public opinion. In 1917, Russia withdrew after revolution, but the US entered, tipping the balance. American troops and resources gave the Allies a crucial edge. The war's impact was felt in every home, forever changing societies. By the autumn of 1918, the tide had decisively turned against the Central Powers. Exhausted and facing dwindling resources, their war machine began to crumble. Germany, realizing the futility of further resistance, desperately sought peace, initiating negotiations for an end to the conflict. Finally, on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed, bringing the brutal fighting of World War I to an official end. The guns fell silent, and a wave of relief swept across the war-torn world. The cost of this great war was staggering, millions dead or wounded, leaving behind a legacy of grief and trauma. Entire societies were scarred, both physically and emotionally, by the unprecedented devastation. The Treaty of Versailles, intended to secure lasting peace, instead imposed harsh and punitive terms on Germany, assigning sole blame for the war, demanding crippling reparations, and imposing severe military restrictions, effectively disarming the nation. Old empires vanished, swept away by the forces of war and revolution, redrawing the political map of Europe and the Middle East. From the ashes of these fallen empires, new nations emerged, fueled by nationalist aspirations and the promise of self-determination. The boundaries of Europe were redrawn, creating a patchwork of new states and altering the geopolitical landscape. Social change accelerated in the wake of the war, as traditional hierarchies and social norms were challenged. Women, who had played a vital role in the war effort, began gaining new rights and roles in society, including the right to vote in many countries. The League of Nations, an ambitious attempt at international cooperation, was created to keep peace and prevent future conflicts. However, its power was ultimately limited by a lack of universal support and the conflicting interests of its member states. The treaty's harshness bred deep resentment and humiliation in Germany, fostering a climate of instability and discontent. This resentment fueled the rise of extremist ideologies and movements promising to restore Germany's former glory. The unresolved political tensions, coupled with severe economic hardship, created a volatile and dangerous situation. Ultimately, these factors set the stage for the even greater catastrophe of World War II, a conflict born from the ashes of the First.